Hello and welcome to the I Actually Read the Book podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Regal, and today we'll be covering a book which has, as I say, a special place in my heart and in my bookshelf, and that is Andrew Klavan's memoir, The Great Good Thing, A Secular Jew Comes to Faith in Christ. And unlike several of the books we'll be talking about on this show, this one, I have an autographed copy. And so here it is. It says, "To Spencer, all the best from Andrew Klavan." And I actually, about 2 months ago, I had the honor, and this is where I got the autograph, I had the honor of meeting the Lord Emperor of the Multiverse himself, Andrew Klavan, at the University of Texas, which I don't go to UT, but I go to A&M, and I found out that he was coming there, so I decided to drive. It's just about a 2-hour drive, so I drove to meet the Lord Emperor. How could you not pass up an opportunity to meet the Lord Emperor of the universe? And so that was great fun to be able to meet him. It's always fascinating, and I had a similar experience when I met Richard Epstein. That it's always interesting when you've only known a person through. You've only known a person through podcasts or especially through movies. I could see I haven't really met a movie star, but I can imagine that when you get to meet somebody whom you've only seen on camera and whose voice you've only heard in recording, that when you actually meet the person and you in the case of someone like Klavan, who you're listening to hours and hours and hours of his podcast, you get to know him pretty well, but he doesn't know you, and so this is the first time that he really reacts to your physical presence and the way that you talk and everything. It's surreal. It's kind of nerve-wracking at times, but it's fascinating. It's really cool to get to meet people whom you idolize, and so that was incredible to get to meet him and have him sign this book. I that's probably one of the fondest memories I've had in the past couple of years. So without further ado, let's get into the book. So Andrew Klavan, if you haven't heard of him, which shame on you if you haven't, but Andrew Klavan is a crime novelist. He's been a crime novelist throughout most of his career. Now he does a legendary, I would say, a podcast that really changed the way I look at the world. And even you might even be able, if you listen to Andrew Klavan, you might pick up different ways in which I've begun to imitate his speaking style and perhaps the way he thinks. I would say that I was thinking earlier, if I wrote a version of the Divine Comedy or of just the Inferno, Klavan would definitely have to be my Virgil. He would have to be my Virgil. He would lead me through the depths of hell and to the heights of heaven. And I just think it'd be a whole lot funnier than the Inferno is. We couldn't keep ourselves from laughing as we watched the damned sit there and bathe in sulfur and brimstone. We just couldn't keep ourselves. It'd just be too funny. The two of us together, we'd have a great time while we were doing it, even if it was completely inappropriate. So, anyway, Klavan. Oh, excuse me. As I said, it was a thriller writer, and it's evident from the way that from the way that he writes this book, because the book, even though it is a memoir, it's paced like a thriller, and you can tell that the guy is used to writing stories that have high levels of suspense and the ways that he grabs your attention. Even the way that he ends chapters sometimes resemble cliffhangers, and so it's very effectively paced throughout the entire book. I am normally a very slow reader, and apparently Klavan is himself too. So I don't consider that too bad advice. If the Lord Emperor of the Multiverse himself says he's guilty of it, I'm a fairly slow reader. It can take me months and months to finish even say a book that's about this size. It could take me up to say 4 months to finish it, and that's just because I'm a slow reader. Another part is that because I get distracted with other books, and that's part of the reason, as I've no doubt said before, why I want to continue this podcast, and is to give me a reason to speed up the process, to get books read in a reasonable amount of time, and then to get me thinking about it and to share my thoughts on books with whoever might be watching this. And if you're watching this, I appreciate it, and I hope I'm interesting enough to keep you tuning in. And so The Great Good Thing is, even though it's not just an autobiography, it's a memoir with a stated theme and purpose, and that is to explain his conversion from a sort of secular agnosticism. He was raised in a secular Jewish family to Christianity, and in the process, his complete change in his person from his younger years to his older years. He jokes a lot on the show about how he's lived two different lives. The first life, he was miserable. He was borderline insane, depressive, and he almost suicidal at the end of this phase of his life. And then now he's an obnoxiously happy and joking person, jocular person. And so this book definitely does a good job of chronicling that change, and it really is fascinating. You'd have to say that the people who are the most fascinating are the ones that undergo the most stark, the most dramatic changes. And so this book starts out at the end, in a way. He starts out with his baptism. And his baptism is that only occurred about 10 or so years ago when he was in his 40s, his mid to late 40s. And then it goes back, so it gives you the sort of the focal point, the starting point, and then he'll trace his life history back from his earliest days to the point of his baptism. And so, excuse me, and just a heads up, I am suffering from a little bit of I'm not sure if it's a cold or something, but if I have coughing spasms, that's a couple of coughing spasms here and there, that's why. And so, the first part of the book, he describes his youth, and but first I'd like to read a little quote from the introduction that describes the fascinating, the somewhat comical way in which he thinks about his conversion. So he jokes a lot about how, he was already a novelist. He was already a well-established novelist and screenwriter. That's another thing, is that he has also written. Not only have his novels been turned into some high-profile movies, like True Crime. One of his novels was turned into a movie with starring Clint Eastwood, and then he had another book, Don't Say a Word, which was turned into a movie that Michael Douglas starred in. And then he also adapted a novel into a screenplay that somebody else wrote called A Shock to the System, which was turned into a movie starring Michael Caine. And so he was a pretty high profile guy in Hollywood for a time, and so he doesn't really talk about it in this book, but he does talk about in his show how emerging from that culture of just unadulterated secularism and leftism, how stark a change that was, and how he never quite fit into that culture, but because he generally was a secular liberal, that he did fit in, and it never really came up. But that over time he lost favor, and he lost several script jobs and movie opportunities because of his outspokenness, first of Christianity, and then later of more right leaning politics. And so he talks about how, just to get back to what we were talking about earlier, he talks about how when he was praying to God one time before he had gone through and had the baptism, he said, "God, if I'm to convert to Christianity, please do not make me a Christian novelist. No matter what happens, please don't make me a Christian novelist. Please don't turn me into one of these writers of milquetoast crappy fiction that is read by 15-year-old girls in high school who like to pretend that they're Christian but really don't live up to the values necessarily, but they think that they can call themselves Christian by reading these milquetoast novels." So just to give a more, this is the way in which he phrases it in the introduction. He says, "I was 49 years old and about to be baptized a Christian. No one could have been more surprised than I was. I never thought I was the type. I had been born and raised a Jew and lived most of my life as an agnostic. I believed in the fullest freedom of thought into the widest reaches of fact and philosophy. I believed in science and analysis and reasonable explanations. I had no time for magical thinking of any kind. I couldn't bear solemn pity. I despised even the ordinary varieties of willful blindness to the tragic shambles of life on earth. And as for what the philosopher Schopenhauer once called the Christian's banal optimism, that forced praise-singing cheer in the face of death and disappointment and inescapable pain, oh God, how I hated it. It set my teeth on edge." And so that's because he comes from it, because he comes to Christianity with this sort of more jaded perspective, informed by the depravity and the brokenness of the human condition. I think that makes him a whole lot more interesting than most of the writers that most of contemporary Christian writers. And that's something I don't know that we'll talk about it much, but I really don't have much esteem for many of the Christian writers that are on the current scene. I think a lot of their work is again, it's banal optimism. It doesn't reach to this. It's sad because Christianity used to be the source of incredible intellectual endeavor and artistic endeavor too. And it's a shame that it's become so profoundly, not necessarily anti-intellectual, though there is some of that, but it's become a place where people just seek to turn their brains off. And it's because of this insidious way in which the religious debate has been phrased between faith and reason, that faith and reason are diametrically opposed to each other, that you either believe that the earth is 6,000 years old or you believe that God exists, and there's no room either way. And if you believe in God, you can't believe in evolution. And I think sadly that's turning a lot of religious believers into true believers, into people who are completely impervious to the more reasonable, the more the more rational side of thinking. But that's beside the point. But that's why I think this book is so important, is because it gives an informed, a literary, intelligent account of a man's religious, or a version of religious conversion, account of religious conversion. And that's why I found this book so thrilling. And if you like contemporary Christian fiction and conversion stories, this might not be your take. I think you should like this book, even if you wouldn't at first, just because it is an intelligent and unique account of a unique story of a man's conversion. And I think that I would hope that there are more stories like this that come out in the future, because honestly, I think the church needs a bit of more of an intellectual revival. I'm thrilled to see voices like William Lane Craig bring a more intellectual perspective, a more intellectual force into the Christian movement. And I'm glad now that Klavan gives a story, gives a more literary rationality, and brings it into it. So he starts out talking about his life as a child in a secular Jewish family. He talks about how his mother was the most committed atheist that he had ever met in his life, and how his father, although he wasn't quite an atheist, he was more of an agnostic, as Klavan thinks. He never really, they only went to synagogue on the high holy days. He never saw his dad praying, and in fact, he gives this funny account of how when he was young, when he was starting out, he wanted to be a writer. He began reading the New Testament because he wanted just to see. He had seen religious references in detective novels like the Sam Spade novels by what's his name, Raymond Chandler, and Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. He had seen different religious references, and so he wanted to check out. He realized that Christianity is central to Western culture, and even to the more popular forms of literature that have emanated from Western literary culture. And so he began reading the Gospel of Luke as purely an educational exercise. And then his dad walked in on him reading the Gospel of Luke, and he said, he describes it, it was the 60s, I was a 15-year-old kid, who knows what I could have been reading or doing in my bedroom. And he would not have been angry if I had been reading hardcore pornography. And yet he came into the room and he was furious, steaming with hatred and with worry, and telling him that if you ever convert, I will disown you. And this is something he touches on later when he actually does convert. His father is dying of I'm not sure if it was cancer, I'm not sure what he was dying of, but he never told his dad till the day he died that he had converted to Christianity, just because he thought it would break his heart. And so he describes the fact that he comes from a secular Jewish background is of course interesting, because it gives him a unique conversion story, but also because it gives him an opportunity. It puts into relief a broader part of his character, which is that the fact that he constantly strives for truth, that you see throughout the story. And it's not just that he's congratulating himself for doing that, or that he's trying to convince us of a flattering picture of himself that he's painting for us in this book. He has lost a lot of, as you could tell for the fact that he lost several movie contracts because he was so outspoken about his religious and political beliefs. He's one who in the words of I'm not sure if it was Dostoevsky in the book and narrating, or if it was another character, but about Dmitri from the Brothers Karamazov. He's one of those who doesn't want millions but wants an answer to his questions. He's one that seeks after truth regardless of the consequences. And so one of the earliest and most powerful examples of this comes in this comes in the chapter, an early chapter, where he describes his bar mitzvah. And when he was being bar mitzvahed, he didn't believe any of it. And so it was very hard for him to convince himself, to appease his conscience, that he was getting up there in front of all his family, in front of all his friends that were Jewish, and pretty much telling lies, seeming to give an affirmation, an inauthentic affirmation of religious belief, something that he didn't believe personally, and then that he was receiving, as he describes, thousands of dollars of gifts and valuables for the bar mitzvah. And so he describes this the scene where he kept this box. He was given a box full of all the valuables, of jewels, of bonds, of cash, everything that he was given as gift for his bar mitzvah. And he describes this scene where he describes that he put it in a chest, he put it in a closet, locked away for weeks on end, because he couldn't stand the thought that he had accrued these, he had gained these, he had gained all these valuables through dishonesty, through an inauthentic profession of faith. And so he says here, "Now when I opened the leather box, when I looked down at the gold and silver and gems and U.S. bonds, it was a bitter, bitter thing. Even the pleasant chill of metal seemed to have faded from the stuff. It felt warm and clammy under my fingertips. I took the box out of its cabinet less and less often, and finally not at all. I just left it there. I pushed it to the back of a shelf, stacking old board games in front of it. Even so, even with the cabinet door shut, I felt its presence, a weight, a sorrow, an accusation. Finally, one night after I'd gone to bed, I forced myself to stay awake. I waited in the dark for more than an hour. My father had to go to work so early in the morning that he was often asleep by 10 at the latest. By midnight, usually, the whole house was quiet. When I felt I'd waited long enough, I opened the toy cabinet quietly. I slid the boxes of board games aside. I drew out the leather box full of jewels. Barefoot in my pajamas, I crept downstairs with the box tucked under my arm." And then this is the crucial part. "Just in back of the house, down a flight of 3 steps, there was a concrete platform. It was set beneath the kitchen window, beside the cellar door. 2 garbage receptacles were built into the cement side by side. I remember, I can feel it as I write, the cold of the concrete on my bare feet as I hurried tiptoe down those steps. I can feel the rough surface of the cement through the knees of my pajamas as I knelt on the platform beside the receptacle. I pressed on the foot pedal with one hand to lift the iron lid. I can still feel the cold of the iron against my palm. With the other hand, I stuffed the leather box into the sodden garbage bag. I remember, I can feel as I write, the damp coffee grounds and the brittle egg shells that rose around my forearm as I worked the box deep into the trash. I wanted to make sure it would not be discovered before the garbage men came in the morning and took the bags away. When the leather treasure box was well hidden, I lowered the heavy lids carefully so it wouldn't make a noise." So that's an example of Klavan's undying search for truth, that in this longing for authenticity, this longing for truthfulness in himself, and I just consider that to be one of the most poignant points of the memoir. Then later he goes on to describe his college years, and in his college years is really when he begins this first phase of his life, so to say, where he becomes a crazy person, in his own words. He becomes depressive. He describes this severe form of ongoing chronic depression that he experienced, not really for any reason, but just because he felt listless, he felt purposeless in life. And over time, he discovers, and we'll get into this more and more, how he discovers the root of his suffering and what he does to combat it and finally overcome it. And so he describes his years at college. He went to Berkeley, but before that, he went on this long trip, this long sordid trip around the country, where he visited almost every state, and just sought jobs here and there, wanting to gain experience, which he felt would help him as a writer, to describe things. Sorry, camera messed up a little. to describe things realistically, authentically, and then God, it's still not. I'm so sorry. That's can't get the camera to stay. There we go. Got it. And then afterwards, he decides just willy nilly to apply to the University of California, Berkeley, and he gets accepted there completely unexpectedly. And so he starts taking college classes there, and he talks about how he was so depressed that he couldn't bring himself even to when he wanted to buy a pack of gum in a convenience store, he couldn't even bring himself to speak to the cashier. And so he talks about how in the midst of this he met his wife, how in the midst of this depression there was one day that changed his life forever, and that's when he met his wife Ellen. And he even describes this book later in the acknowledgments as a love letter to Ellen. He says, if this book seems like a love letter to my wife, it's because it is. And this is one of the most beautiful passages in the entire book when he describes his marriage to his wife, which is truly, by all account, but by his account, and just by the fact of how he writes about it and the way that he talks about his wife on the show, and the fact that they stayed together for 40 years, it is an incredible marriage. It says, my marriage to Ellen has not been an ordinary one, not by a long shot. It has been a lifelong romance. I love her, by which I mean her good is my good, and her misfortune mine. And I love her passionately, by which I mean I hunger for her company as well as her touch. This has not changed even a little in our nearly 40 years together. In nearly 40 years, we have had exactly one quarrel. It was a meaningless flare of temper more than 30 years ago. Our apartment was being painted. Everything was in chaos. I had a night job and hadn't slept in weeks. We were both out of sorts and we snapped at each other. It quickly passed. For the rest, we have been poor and rich together, crazy and sane, happy and miserable, but never wholly out of harmony. I find I can no longer even dream a woman who is not in some sense she. But more than that, our marriage has taken on a life of its own. It has become a third creation, greater than anything we are individually or together. I like to think we're perfectly decent people, Ellen and I, but I have all the usual flaws of men and she of women. We're clearly neither one of us as special as this vessel that contains us. Our marriage shines around us and between us with an otherly light, a sacred habitation for our shambolic humanity. It is soul stuff made visible. Living within such a spiritual sanctuary has an effect on you over the years. Just knowing such a marriage can exist refashions the way that you look at life. For me, it puts limits on what I would call illusory or meaningless. Other men could believe that subjective experience is by nature relative and unreliable. Other men could reason from suffering to nihilism. Not me. Our marriage gave undeniable substance to the inner experience of true love, and true love in turn shone a light on the redemptive possibilities even of tragedy. Even the kingdom of evil came to seem to me like only the empty space where true love might have been. And when over time I had reasoned my way to God, it was our marriage in part that made me trust my reasoning. I trusted myself because I had recognized love when I saw it, and it was the fact of our long love that had slowly revealed to me a greater love than ours. The love that was our love's source and inspiration. It was as if our marriage had guided me through my days from a realm beyond the ordinary, the way a lodestar shines from deepest space, yet nonetheless leads you home. So, very moving passage. And nevertheless, even though he had such a wonderful marriage, his depression persisted through his marriage, and it wasn't for many years until he figured out what was wrong and then sought treatment for it. And that is also that's one of the more fascinating parts of the book, is where he describes how he transitioned from this insanity, from this depression to an experience of profound joy and peace and love that has formed his life from then on. And so he describes his procession in particular from agnosticism to religious faith in terms of five epiphanies. It's the title of one of the chapters. And so, first, to summarize, this is the way he summarizes what the epiphanies are: the truth of suffering, the wisdom of joy, the reality of love, the possibility of clear perception, the laughter at the heart of mourning. Those five epiphanies are what led him to conclude to finally come to faith first in God and then later in Christianity itself. And so he describes how the low point, the nadir, so to say, of his depression, the low point of his life, where he was very close. He was just at the brink, or he was just on the edge of taking his life away, of committing suicide. So he's describing here how he's sitting up at night, his kids and his wife are asleep, smoking a cigarette and listening to a baseball game on the radio, and he talks about how there's this player for the Dodgers who no, sorry, the Mets. For the Mets, who was a Christian and who was sometimes obnoxious about it. How he would always, he would be interviewed after he made a home run or did some incredible feat on the baseball field, and he would just say, "Oh, hallelujah, Jesus, hallelujah, Jesus," and how he couldn't stand that. And so he talks about how in this passage, if he had done that tonight, that night that he was sitting there brooding over suicide, he might very well have gone through with it. But that didn't happen. This is what happened instead. Now, as I sat at my desk in a cloud of smoke and self-pitying sadness, the announcer on the radio described Carter stepping up to bat. It was a crucial moment in a close game. There were men on base in scoring position. Carter smacked a grounder to the outfield. A notoriously slow runner because of his bad knees, he took off down the line as fast as he could. Somehow he managed to beat the throw to first. The single scored the winning runs. It was an exciting moment, but I was barely listening. I hardly cared. I just went on thinking, I don't know how to live. I don't know how to live. When the game was over, the on-field reporter corralled Carter for a post-victory return. The reporter asked how the catcher was able to run so fast when his knees were so badly damaged from years of squatting behind home plate. If in that moment Carter had done his Jesus routine, if he had praised Christ or sung hallelujah, I don't think his comments would have reached me at all. I think I would have grimaced and shuddered at his happy talk piety. Then I would have shrugged it off and gone on toying with the notion of self-murder. But tonight, for some reason, Carter decided to leave the religious stuff out of it. Instead, he answered, very simply, he said, "Sometimes you just have to play in pain." The words jarred me instantly out of my depressive reverie. I remember blinking in the shadows as if waking up. I remember slowly turning my gaze from the empty darkness to the radio. I remember repeating the sentence silently to myself. It seemed to me for all the world as if Carter had heard my thoughts as I sat there. It seemed to me he had heard me thinking, I don't know how to live, and had responded over the airwaves with the only honest answer there is. Sometimes you just have to play in pain. I nodded in the darkness, my eyes growing damp. I thought, yes, that's right. That's it exactly. And I can do it too. I can play at pain. If I have to. I know I can. That's something I actually know how to do. I put out my cigarette. I got out of my chair. I turned off the radio. I left the bedroom. And I never considered suicide again. So I think that's one of the most moving passages in the book, where he reaches the low point of his depression of many years, and then he finally turns away. He finally turns to embrace life. And that's just the beginning of the process of how he finds God. He then describes how he meets this therapist that completely changed his life, brought him out of depression, and he emphasizes repeatedly that he refused to embrace the religious consequences of his logic, the religious implications of his logic, until he felt that he had completely regained the use of his reason, of his logical faculties, because he didn't want to believe. He didn't want it to be a crutch. He didn't want it to be a sort of Freudian, the way that Sigmund Freud dismissed religion. He did not want it to be. He did not want anybody to be able to impute to his religious faith that it was merely a crutch in order that he used to bring him out of this insanity and depression. And so he describes how effective this treatment was. He explored his psyche, he explored every dark, deep trauma and disturbing part of his life with this therapist, and eventually he came out of the depression. It's almost a miracle. And he describes how. He describes actually another interesting part of the book is where he talks about his flirtation with atheism. How it was brought about because he started engaging in Zen meditation, and in a way when he began meditating, the mantra that kept flashing in his head was "No God," and so he started to think, yeah. Agnosticism isn't enough for me. If I'm going to not believe in God, I have to go all the way. I have to become an atheist. And so he started reading atheist works like Kafka, Nietzsche, and eventually the Marquis de Sade. And it was the Marquis de Sade that in a way it's funny that the devil, so to say, brought him to Christ. That the Marquis de Sade, sadistic comes from him. This horribly immoral, violent, pornographic philosopher is the one that taught him to reject atheism, because de Sade took atheism to its logical conclusion, which is that without God, which is the same one that's talked about in The Brothers Karamazov, the Dostoevsky novel, that if there is no God, there is no morality, there is no right and wrong, anything goes. And so, after reading that, he shied away from atheism, and that was just the beginning part. That was just the beginning step on his road to religious faith, or it was one of the beginning steps. And then eventually, he describes how when his oh goodness, I am so sorry. He describes how when his daughter was born, Faith, who's actually Faith Klavan is now Faith Moore, and she writes a lot for a website called PJ Media. And he describes the ecstasy, the profound joy that he felt when he saw his daughter come out of his wife, and how that changed him forever. That was an experience of the transcendental that stayed with him forever. It was another one of those things, just like the bliss of his marriage, that made it impossible for him to doubt the reality of the transcendent and of eventually of God. And so those are the main themes of his book as I like to explore it. So to summarize, the progression of his faith goes from being a secular Jew who suffers from this chronic insanity, from this chronic depression, meeting his wife, which is a turning point in his life that eventually culminates in his complete transformation of character. And along the way, he has those 5 epiphanies, and those eventually, he says that the one leap of faith that he took in his conversion, his entire conversion, is the belief that there are objective moral values, that there are some things that are right or wrong, regardless of what anyone else thinks. That if the world was Nazi world, if the Nazis won World War II and had brainwashed everyone in the world, that the Holocaust would still be wrong, that it would still be wrong to engage in ethnic cleansing, to murder people because of their race or because of different genetic factors that you think are impure, regardless if everyone believed that it was right. And so that is the one statement that he believed, that's the one article of faith, so to say, that he takes on faith, and the rest just follows logically, according to Klavan. And so then, of course, he goes on to describe in a fascinating chapter called "This Thing of Darkness," which is a reference to a Tempest, a line from Shakespeare's Tempest, where Prospero describes Caliban, the deformed, devilish creature on the isle, as "this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine." He talks about how he wrestled with anti-Semitism as the legacy of anti-Semitism in Christendom, the horrendous history of pogroms and of discrimination, of anti-Semitism in Europe, and how he wrestled with that, how he visited the death camps in Europe in order to, in a way, not only to reconcile himself to Western, or to in a way, he had to go through this, as he describes it. He had to undergo this process in order to fully embrace Christianity. He had to deal with the question of anti-Semitism. How do I, as an ethnic Jew, how do I deal with the fact that Christians perpetrated some of the worst atrocities against Jews in history? And so that's a very captivating chapter. I won't dwell on much here, just because it doesn't have much to do, so to say, with the overall theme of the book, or it's a fascinating part of it, but it's not necessary to understand the work as a whole. And then after that is his baptism. He goes back again to the scene in the church where he's getting baptized, and only a couple of his friends are there. His pastor, who's a friend of his, is there too, performing the baptism on him. And he describes the death of his father there, that he never could bring himself to tell his father because he was on his deathbed, and he thought it would just break his heart to hear that his son had converted to Christianity away from Judaism. And so that's the great good thing. It is a great good book, so to say. It is an incredible work. It's an incredible memoir. I think it's one of the greatest books I've ever read in my life. I think if there were any justice in this world, and pardon me for getting political, if the Pulitzer Prize were not run, and the Pulitzer Prize, the New York Times, We're not all the review the outlets that review books. We're not dominated by brain dead leftists who only care about only care about whether or not fiction writers agree with their political principles and with their bland nihilistic ideologies. I think the great good thing would be all over the media. It would be celebrated as a supreme work of not just memoir, but of storytelling, of religious and philosophy in general. And I think that it can be read profitably by just about any reader. So this book gets my full-throated, complete endorsement, and I hope that you will check it out because it is a great read. It is paced, as I said earlier, it's paced like a thriller, and the subject matter, which happens to be the writer, is just an endlessly fascinating. He's an endlessly fascinating mind. He has an endlessly fascinating story, and I think that anybody could read this and derive great pleasure and profit out of it, both intellectually and just for entertainment value. So thank you for joining me. I'm Spencer Regal. Thank you for joining the I Actually Read the Book podcast, and we'll see you next time.